Hello, YouTubers out in YouTube land. It's me, your favorite Bible thumper, Mr. Morris, and welcome to Morris Ministries. And today we're going to be talking about the gay agenda. Now, the first thing I'd like to read to you is one of the points written by Han S. Herlong Jr.'s entry into the Congressional Record on Thursday, January 10th of 1963. Now, he was reading off of Cleo Skuzin's book of How to Make America Communist. And all of these points eventually came true. And point 26 is presenting homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. So each one of these points about how America's future, particularly point number 26, which we're talking about today, shows you that Congress was having an open dialogue about a gay culture in America, or at least how to influence sexuality in America, whether it be politically or chemically, which we'll get into in a few minutes. But most people would agree, or at least think, that gay people are genetically that way. And if that was gay, it would be a deformity as it's written in the DSM-5, but that's a whole other issue, or even gender identity disorder. But the genetic basis for homosexuality was addressed in quite a few studies as realistically as far back as time itself, going forward and to even today. Today you don't see general publications discussing how there is no actual genetic basis for homosexuality. Bowling Green State University, as well as Ibans University in Nigeria, make a specific point about how there is no genetic qualities of homosexuality. That genetically one cannot be homosexual. But you can induce homosexual responses, and you can influence homosexual culture, which is part of these individual studies. And influencing homosexuals chemically, let's say by endocrine disruptors. An endocrine disruptor is something that can change the hormones in your body. So let's say if you have more estrogen, you'll suddenly have more testosterone, and you'll have more male features, whereas a male that has more estrogen in them will start having more female features. And there was a study done back in 2007 that specifically discussed how in reptiles you can produce this exact response. And they would begin to identify as a different version of themselves or as the opposing sex, but it does not genetically changes you because you can reverse these effects when the hormone is no longer present. A genetic response would be something that cannot actually be changed in one's lifetime. So there are chemicals that can be introduced to you that would produce a response of making one identify as gay. So to be more clear, in today's world you can see people identifying by the opposite sex. And it's all because of chemical imbalances that people don't actually have enough of the hormone that their gender requires, because there is actually only two fundamental genders. So women who have more testosterone identify themselves as male, and you can see that they have more male features, which is why it is that way. And even in sports today, you see women who are more masculine wanting to compete with men, and men that are more effeminate wanting to compete with women. Look at Lance Armstrong and Cyborg Ronda Rousey, perfect examples of all this stuff. But extrapolating backwards, in, what was it? Oh yes, that's right. Any estrogens. They did a whole studies in fish about using specific chemicals that would try and require gender bending. In other words, like how having males either have female genitals or vice versa, and whether or not you can sexually orient them. Well, in most cases, they just end up dying. That's because most of these same chemicals also produces high rates of cancer, and in things like fish, it promotes much faster. It works almost the same way as a virus. Well, but what are these chemicals that are being introduced to make these people that way? Well, it's things like Glyphosate, Atrazine, Simazine. Each one of them causes a conversion of atomic fluid cells and create endocrine imbalances, which would promote these specific features. Perfect example, glyphosates, which is, there's a whole series of court cases that have been out about this, that have been introduced into the herbicidal supply, meaning that they spray on your local crop fields and they get introduced to the plants, and then the plants then are eaten by you. But that's not the way it really works nowadays, thanks to Monsanto and GMOs. They're actually genetically modifying their crops to have these specific herbicides within them. And as we know, glyphosates cause breast cancer in estrogen receptors, which is one of the studies I'll put below, meaning that it's specifically a cancer that directs or attacks the endocrine system, so that you cannot produce the same amount of hormones And then eventually you have more of the opposing features like we were talking about before. You can also see things like the general concerns over these herbicides that have been addressed so many times. And this consensus has been going on since really 2007, maybe even a little bit earlier, but they're still being used today, even back really as far as the 70s when they first promoted these studies and how they would affect humans. They already knew what would actually happen, but they wanted to make sure that it was happening on a grand scale, which is why they're being introduced faster and faster now that the public is more aware of these things. But glyphosates, which have a higher rate of cancers, but there's things like Atrazine, which is a specific endocrine disruptor, and the EPA toxicity reports specifically say how it is detrimental to your health, and more specifically children's health, because it does not promote the necessary features or absolute growth development that would come into adulthood. So if you have a child that is taking something like this, the chemical imbalance would actually stop their growth and leave them in almost a state of prepubescence. And psychologically speaking, where America is today, you can see nothing but children. They haven't actually produced to that next stage in adulthood. And even Simazine, Simazine by the US EPA specifically said how the primary toxicological effects of regulatory concern are all subchronic and chronic exposure scenarios. Or let me rephrase this, that if you are introduced to it enough, it will cause issues, and if you're introduced to it a lot, it'll cause issues. Well, but in San Francisco, there was an article published that specifically talked about how all of these chemicals are actually in the water supply. And if it's in the water supply there, it's almost in the water supply everywhere. Because LA does not have its own water supply, it gets funneled through from somewhere else. And that same water supply has to get pumped to other places. You see? And that is the fundamental issue, is that these chemicals are being introduced to you on a very daily basis. Everything you eat, everything you drink has these chemicals in them and is creating hormone imbalances within people. It is not making people gay, but it is influencing the gay culture and promoting subconsciously the sexual promiscuity that's there, that is then being endorsed politically. Something that is more on a political scale would be things like AIDS. AIDS being the only disease that ever had civil rights attached to it. The only disease ever that actually gave a group of people more rights. Identified a group of people and promoted them upward. Because there needed to be awareness. There needed to be a cultural revolution around the fact that these infringed people, needed to be made aware of, and that they have rights the same as you and shouldn't be treated any differently. That kind of attitude influences all of America going forward. Now you see the world today as, well, you can't be hateful, you can't be bigoted because your ideas are different than mine, and the victim mentality. The actual promotion of a gay culture promotes, realistically, a culture that cannot thrive. This is one reason why, historically speaking, anyone that has ever supported a gay culture never really survives. Now, taking all these things into consideration, you can see how the government is funneling people through the system. And also, things like fluoride, but obviously fluoride is its own special issue of things. How it lowers people's IQs, but I'll put that in the description below as well, some of those studies. But as you eliminate people's intelligence, because as their development moves forward, they're still of a child like mine, and if they don't have the IQ of the natural child that would have been produced with the regular hormones, then they would have never come to realize that this is what's actually happening to them. And this is going completely internationally. That is more on a chemical, non-genetic basis, and you can see the legislation that's specifically being passed towards a gay culture. Just look at marriage. Marriage is one of those things where it's being endorsed publicly by the United States. You're allowed to marry anybody, even though gays themselves cannot marry, because marriage is a religious institution that was promoted by men, women having sex. Because the fact of two becoming one cannot happen if you're either A, rubbing sticks, or trying to bump holes together. It just doesn't happen that way. Okay, so you cannot get married, but they're still promoting the idea of that marriage. And since gays have the most unhealthy lifestyle, what was it? The Family Research Institute published a study not too long ago talking about the inherent degeneracies within the gay community, how you can't actually keep a marriage together, that you'll have multiple sexual partners within one deemed monogamous relationship or supposed monogamous relationship. And the fact that the drugs and many other things that are associated with trying to do things that are completely unnatural, all the diseases and infections that result from sexually transmitted diseases, but that's a whole other issue. It's a legislation that's promoting that. You can see it completely on a national level. A gay agenda is being pushed, and the studies are showing that it's trying to make it more inclusive for everybody, because they actually want God to come down and judge the nation as everyone equally being evil. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, leave it down below, and thank you for tuning in.